In the heart of Gracemer City's opulent court chambers, a pregnant woman in tattered clothes staggered through the doors, her eyes filled with heartbreak and her spirit trembling on the brink. No one could have imagined that on this day of glittering suits and marble floors, the dark secrets of a revered millionaire would spill out for the world to see. What came next was a clash of dignity against greed, loyalty against lust, and justice against unbridled ambition. In mere moments, this unlikely spectacle would transform from a case on the docket to the most explosive trial Gracemer City had ever witnessed. Ava McKinley Rutherford was once the picture of sophistication. Born to a middle-class family in the quiet suburbs of Cloverfield, her life had seemed destined for an unremarkable path until she caught the eye of Byron Rutherford. Byron was one of the wealthiest men in Gracemer City, an influential figure whose name was splashed across philanthropic events and charity galas. He was the kind of man who lit up an entire ballroom with a mere smile, whose expertly tailored suits and steel-gray hair made him look every inch the dignitary he projected himself to be. To their friends, the Rutherfords were a modern-day fairy tale, a power couple, philanthropic sweethearts, and soon-to-be parents. Behind the gilded gates of their sprawling estate, however, an unseen turbulence had taken root. Ava was growing uneasy. Byron's late nights multiplied, his excuses got thinner, his once effusive affection chilling to the touch. There were hush-hush phone calls in the dead of night, phone numbers saved under aliases that never seemed quite believable. Most nights, Ava lay awake in the darkness, one hand protectively over her swelling belly, the other desperately clutching the duvet as if to ground herself from an unspoken dread. Rumors reached her ears, from whispered chatter at country club luncheons to the subtle hints from their longtime butler Giles. Something was amiss, something that threatened to tear apart not just her marriage, but also her very identity. Yet in public, Ava maintained a polished veneer. Her family had raised her to be a pillar of grace. No matter the storms at home, she arrived at gala benefits with her hair pinned into a flawless chignon, smiling and playing the devoted wife. But that facade was thinning day by day. Her gaze grew distant, and onlookers who knew her best sensed an invisible weight settling on her heart. It was only a matter of time before illusions shattered. The day came when a bold letter showed up in their mailbox, no return address, no signature. Inside, there was a photograph that changed everything, a blurry but damning image of Byron with another woman locked in a steamy embrace in front of a tall building at night. Ava's breath hitched. She stared at the photograph again and again, the edges of her vision flickering with shock and heartbreak. She recognized the woman, Celia Duvall, a fixture in certain high society circles, known for her flamboyant presence and rumored thirst for power. Celia had hovered around Byron at charity events, but Ava had dismissed it as harmless social mingling. Now, the photo told a different story. She realized that while she had believed her marital fortress was unassailable, betrayal had quietly crept inside. Ava wanted to confront Byron immediately, but fear stilled her. She knew how meticulously Byron curated his public image. He was the unstoppable millionaire who donated to children's hospitals and paraded around with local politicians, like an unofficial ambassador of goodwill. Ava suspected that if Byron was cornered, he would fight dirty to protect his empire. That thought sent an icy dread through her, but a voice inside her head whispered, "You need the truth." In the weeks that followed, Ava played a dangerous game. She collected receipts, took covert glances at Byron's phone, and quietly reached out to old acquaintances Like Grace Weatherly, a private investigator, she had once helped with a charity scholarship for PI training. Grace was discreet but effective. She prowled through Celia Duvall's public records, followed her to luxury boutiques, even slipped into exclusive clubs to track her spending and appointments. It wasn't just an affair. The deeper Grace dug, the murkier everything became. Celia was not merely a temptress with a penchant for wealthy men. She was an ambitious power broker in her own right, rumored to be forging ties with questionable business entities to gain more influence. Grace found bank transactions linking Celia to an offshore account in the Caymans. Names on the account overlapped suspiciously, with a shell corporation that funneled money into Byron's philanthropic foundation. Whispers turned into urgent red flags, and soon the suspicion of financial impropriety morphed into outright alarm. Ava felt torn. On one hand, Byron was her husband, the father of her unborn child, and the man with whom she had built a life. Even if he had strayed, she clung to a desperate hope that there had to be some sort of misunderstanding. On the other hand, the growing mound of evidence suggested Byron was entangled in criminal activity. The heartbreak was twofold, losing a husband not just to another woman, but to the tempting labyrinth of corruption. Late one night, Ava cornered Byron in his study, an opulent room, lined with dark, mahogany shelves and a sprawling antique desk. He was leafing through papers under the dim light of a green-shaded lamp. With trembling hands, she slammed down the photograph of him and Celia on his desk. Her eyes blazed with betrayal. Byron stiffened. Then, in a chillingly calm voice, he pressed a hand to his brow. "You have no idea what you're getting into, Ava," he whispered. There was no apology, no shock, no attempts at denial. The confession hung there, unspoken, as if the photograph alone made it clear. The room seemed to darken around them. She felt her throat tighten. Why, she asked, tears brimming in her eyes. "Why do this?" He looked past her, his gaze fixated on the flickering glow of the lamp. "It's complicated," he said, in a voice weighed down by something akin to regret, but overshadowed by arrogance. "I'll make it go away. Just don't interfere." Ava felt the baby kick inside her, a reminder that everything she did now was not just for herself. She spat her words with fierce determination. "I won't let you destroy everything we stand for." Byron inhaled slowly, as though preparing himself for a rigorous negotiation at his boardroom. "Everything I do is for us, our family's future," he said. "You can't possibly understand the deals that keep this empire afloat." She tore her gaze away, fresh tears burning her cheeks. In that moment, she made a vow to protect her child's future, even if it meant taking Byron down. Word spread quickly among Gracemer City's elite that trouble was brewing in the Rutherford household. Byron and Ava tried to keep up appearances, arriving separately at charity dinners, exchanging cold small talk while the cameras flashed. But behind the scenes, an entire network of legal advisors and crisis managers swarmed Byron's estate like bees. Ava stayed mostly confined to her private rooms, her pregnancy more pronounced every day, her mind racing with dread at what might unfold. Then, in a twist that no one saw coming, Celia Duvall made her move. On a Monday morning, tabloids splashed stories of Celia's new business partnership with Byron, a merger of two philanthropic foundations under the banner of Future Promise Initiative. Photographs showed Celia perched elegantly in a designer dress, flashing a triumphant smile, while Byron stood next to her with that practiced look of calm. The narrative was carefully spun. The two of them were forging a philanthropic powerhouse, to help orphans, scholarship funds, and medical research. Ava's name was notably absent. From a tablet in her bedroom, Ava watched Celia's press conference in absolute horror. Celia's voice was smooth and confident as she fielded questions about the partnership, crediting Byron's unwavering support and shared values. Ava noticed subtle but telling gestures, the playful tilt of Celia's head toward Byron, the way her eyes danced with victory. Ava's fury turned to heartbreak. She whispered to herself, "He's parading her in public now. Does he have no shame?" But behind the veneer of charitable ambition, something sinister churned. Anonymous tips began flooding local journalist Allen Winston's inbox at the Daily Chronicle. Winston, known for exposing the St. Clair political scandal years back, was a pit bull when it came to uncovering corruption. He began digging into the finances of the newly formed Future Promise Initiative. He found massive sums of money being moved from shell corporations into the foundation, with suspicious stops in tax havens along the way. Through her contacts, Ava heard rumors that Byron and Celia planned to siphon a fraction of these donations for their personal gain and funnel the rest into bigger, more illicit ventures. Ava shuddered at the thought this was bigger than just infidelity. It was a web of corruption, and Byron seemed inextricably tangled in it. She turned to her friend, private investigator Grace Weatherly, once again. Ava gathered every shred of paper she could from around the mansion: bank statements, wire transfers, lists of donors. She hid them in a battered suitcase in the back of her closet. With Grace's help, Ava planned to build the ultimate case against Byron and Celia. She needed more than heartbreak or moral outrage. She needed something to ensure that if Byron tried to leave her destitute, or worse, claim custody of the unborn baby, she would have a fighting chance. The scandal escalated at breakneck speed. Allen Winston published a series of biting exposés in the Daily Chronicle, questioning the philanthropic legitimacy of Future Promise Initiative. He laid out the suspicious paper trail, the questionable donors, and the shell companies. Suddenly, Byron Rutherford and Celia Duvall weren't just the talk of the town. They were persons of interest in an active investigation, possibly federal. Within weeks, Byron and Celia received summonses to appear in court for a hearing. The charge was potential fraud tied to charitable funds, but rumors suggested more charges were on the horizon. Money laundering, conspiracy, tax evasion. The list seemed to grow. The date was set. The entire city braced itself for the spectacle. The public was gripped by the drama of it all. The revered billionaire, once a paragon of virtue, dragged into the spotlight for alleged criminal activity. But no one expected the bombshell that would explode in the courtroom the morning of the hearing. Reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers crowded the courthouse steps. Byron arrived in a sleek town car, stepping out in a tailored suit, flanked by an army of lawyers. Celia emerged from another luxury vehicle, sporting a designer outfit, her lips curved in a subtle smirk that seemed to say she was sure she'd walk away unscathed. And then a gasp rippled through the crowd. Ava Rutherford appeared on foot, her pregnant belly conspicuous under a threadbare dress that looked like it had seen better days. Gone were the designer labels she'd once worn so gracefully. Her hair hung loose and dark circles framed her eyes. She clutched a worn-out handbag and waddled toward the courthouse with an unsteady gait. To anyone watching, she looked more like a struggling mother-to-be from the wrong side of the tracks than the wife of a millionaire. Every camera lens pivoted in her direction, hungry for a shot of this shocking contrast. Ava was unstoppable, fueled by righteous indignation and heartbreak. She didn't cower from the bright flashes. She looked straight ahead, determined to see justice done. At the top of the steps, Byron froze. Their eyes locked for a heartbeat. He tried to maintain composure, but the tension was palpable. Celia sneered as though quietly amused that Ava had stooped so low as to show up in rags. A hush fell in the hallway as Ava stepped into the courtroom. Whispers spread among the crowd. What happened to her? Is she doing this on purpose? Where's her husband's money now? Ava ignored them all, taking a seat in the gallery, cradling her belly as if bracing for the fight of her life. Judge Harriet Bloom presided over the case. She was a formidable woman in her early 60s, known for her zero-tolerance approach to corruption. The gavel struck, calling the hearing to order. The prosecution announced their preliminary findings implicating both Byron Rutherford and Celia Duvall in orchestrating fraudulent charity activities and money laundering. Their voices resonated in the wood-paneled courtroom, painting a damning picture of betrayal and greed. Byron's defense lawyer, the renowned Maxwell Boyd, argued that any financial irregularities were mere oversights, that everything would be cleared up in due time. Celia's lawyer echoed the same stance. The tension soared when the prosecution mentioned a key witness, someone intimately connected to Byron's finances, someone who had been amassing documents for weeks. The mention of Ava Rutherford sent a wave of gasps around the room. Ava rose from her seat. Clad in her threadbare dress, she walked to the witness stand. Her gaze flickered to Byron, who stared back with a mixture of shock and dread. Grace Weatherly had prepared her thoroughly, and Ava carried herself with quiet determination. One by one, she revealed the bank statements, wire transfers, and corporate documents linking Byron and Celia to the scandal. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Cameras and court sketch artists scribbled furiously to capture the emotion etched in Ava's face. The tension was almost too thick to bear. Tears glistened in Ava's eyes as she recounted the emotional toll of discovering not only her husband's affair, but also the dizzying labyrinth of deceit that threatened to ruin countless charitable beneficiaries. She glanced down at her belly, her voice trembling. "I had to do this for my child," she confessed. "This is not about revenge or money. This is about right and wrong. I refuse to let my baby be part of this legacy of lies." Suddenly, Celia sprang up from her seat, ignoring her lawyer's attempts to restrain her. "She's lying. She's just a jealous wife trying to tear us down," she screeched. Judge Bloom rapped her gavel, warning Celia to remain quiet. But the damage was done. The outburst only made Celia seem volatile and desperate. Byron's expression turned stormy. His jaw clenched, and for a moment he looked like he might try to rush to the stand himself. But Maxwell Boyd placed a hand on Byron's shoulder, silently advising him to keep his composure. It was too late. The entire courtroom had seen the crack in his polished facade. When Ava finally stepped down, the atmosphere was electric. The hearing would continue with more witness testimonies, but in that single day, Ava had shattered Byron's veneer of innocence. She sank onto a nearby bench, her breath ragged tears threatening to spill. She felt no victory, only a profound sense of loss and exhaustion. She'd just gone up against the man she once loved beyond reason, but she had done what she believed was right. During a recess, Ava found herself in a quiet corner of the courthouse near a window that overlooked the city. Rain pelted the glass, each drop forming rivulets that mirrored her tears. She thought back to the early days of her marriage, how Byron used to surprise her with thoughtful little gifts, how they would dance in their living room under flickering candlelight. The memory felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Somewhere behind her, Celia's raised voice echoed in the corridor. "We'll bury her in legal fees. She won't have a dime left." The mistress's rage was borderline hysterical, no longer masked by the refined facade she presented to the public. Ava closed her eyes, steeling herself. She recalled the battered suitcase of documents she'd given to Grace. She had done the right thing, but it still felt like her heart was being ripped apart. Just then, she felt a gentle touch on her shoulder. She turned to see Grace Weatherly. The private investigator gave Ava a reassuring nod. "You did well," Grace said softly. "Allen Winston is waiting outside. He wants a quote, something about how you feel." Ava shook her head, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I'm too tired to talk to the press. All I want is for the truth to come out." Grace frowned, glancing over her shoulder. "You should know. Byron's legal team is moving fast. They want to file a motion to dismiss your claims, painting you as a mentally unstable spouse. They might even say you're trying to deflect from postpartum depression or something like that. It's ugly." Ava clenched her fists. "He won't make me out to be crazy." She felt the baby move again, and a wave of protective fierceness coursed through her. She would endure whatever Byron threw at her. For her child's future, she couldn't back down. That evening, Ava took refuge in a modest motel on the outskirts of Gracemer City. She could have stayed with friends, but she wanted solitude to gather her thoughts. She didn't even want to step foot in the mansion that Byron still occupied, especially with Celia's presence lurking about. Her ragged attire wasn't just for dramatic effect. Ava truly had cut herself off from Byron's financial means, determined not to let him dangle money over her as leverage. She didn't sleep much. News outlets were abuzz with the day's events. Some lauded Ava's bravery. Others questioned her motives. Was she just a scorned wife looking for revenge? Ava forced herself to ignore the sensational headlines. She had bigger worries. She still had to testify further in the trial. The next hearing was only a few days away. Meanwhile, Byron and Celia retreated behind the ornate gates of Rutherford Estate. They refused to comment publicly, instead letting Maxwell Boyd issue statements about grossly exaggerated claims and complete confidence in Mr. Rutherford's exoneration. Celia posted cryptic messages on social media, subtly painting herself as the victim of Ava's witch hunt. Yet behind the scenes, as Grace discovered through her informants, Byron's accountants were scrambling to hide or rearrange funds, indicating a last-ditch effort to shield their assets from seizure. In the middle of one rainy night, Ava's phone buzzed. She hesitated before answering. It was an unknown number. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice faint with exhaustion. "It's me," Byron replied. For a moment, Ava's heart squeezed. She could almost picture him the way he'd been back in their honeymoon phase, gentle, tender, devoted. But that was a memory. The reality was a man who had betrayed her on multiple levels. "What do you want?" She managed her voice steady. He sighed on the other end. "I want to settle this quietly. If you retract your statement, if you say you made a mistake, I promise you'll be taken care of. And our child, they'll have everything." Ava's grip tightened on the phone. "Is this about money for you or shame?" There was a pause and Byron's tone hardened. "Don't make this difficult. You know I have resources. You don't want to go down this road." She shut her eyes, tears threatening again. "You did this, Byron, you and Celia, and you're worried about your reputation instead of your child's future. I won't go back on what I said. Good night." She hung up, hugging herself as the tears finally spilled over. She felt the baby move, and that gave her a strange solace. She was doing the right thing, as painful as it was. The next morning, Ava discovered a small group of supporters outside the motel. Word had spread that she was staying there, and a few local activists and mothers had shown up with donations of baby clothes, warm meals, and moral support. At first, Ava was embarrassed. She'd never been the type to accept charity. But as she gazed at their kind faces, something inside her softened. She was no longer alone in this fight. Among them was a timid woman named Lucy Finch, who revealed that her father had once worked for Byron's foundation. Lucy's father had mysteriously lost his job when he questioned some discrepancies in the charity's books. She offered to testify to Byron's intimidation tactics. Another was Henry Valdez, who had once partnered with Byron but backed out after suspecting fraud. He too was willing to speak up. Ava was overwhelmed. She thanked them through tears, realizing how Byron's carefully curated public image had overshadowed the quiet victims of his questionable dealings. All these people had been waiting for someone brave enough to challenge him openly. "I'm so grateful," Ava murmured, pressing a hand to her belly. "Every word of truth helps." Back at the courthouse, the case was building steam. Federal investigators were involved now, thanks to the uncovered money laundering schemes. The local district attorney's office was bombarded with new testimonies and leads. Judge Bloom set a trial date rather than just preliminary hearings. She wanted the full scope of the allegations laid out in a proper legal battle. Ava braced herself. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was shaping up to be one of the most high-profile corruption trials in the state's recent history. In the days leading up to the trial, Byron's legal team went on the offensive. They filed motions questioning Ava's credibility, hinting that her emotional state as a pregnant woman compromised her clarity and judgment. They dug into her past, searching for any skeletons that might be used to smear her. The tabloids devoured every bit of the spectacle, debating whether Ava was a cunning gold digger or a hapless victim. Celia, meanwhile, continued her public relations campaign. She was spotted at fashion shows, lunching with celebrities, and feigning shock whenever the topic of the investigation arose. "It's such a pity," she told one reporter, "that a simple business partnership to do good in the world has been twisted into something so ugly." Her crocodile tears were enough for some gullible onlookers, but many in Gracemer City had begun to see the cracks in her act. Ava fortified her own position. She met with the district attorney and handed over all the documents she and Grace had meticulously collected. She recounted every instance of Byron's intimidation. She even gave a signed statement about the emotional and psychological abuse she'd endured. The DA was particularly interested in a set of emails that revealed Byron and Celia discussing offshore accounts. It was damning evidence, potentially enough to land them both behind bars if authenticated. Yet Ava's biggest fear wasn't just losing the trial, it was losing her baby's future. Byron had endless resources, and if he won, he could manipulate the courts to gain custody of their child, painting Ava as unstable. She wouldn't let that happen. Finally, the trial began. National news outlets had joined the frenzy, turning the courthouse into a media circus. Judge Bloom wore an exasperated expression at the start of proceedings, warning she would have anyone disturbing the order escorted out. The tension was palpable. One by one, the prosecution laid out their case: fraudulent documents, wire transfers, shell companies, testimonies from former employees. Ava's earlier statements were pivotal, but now they were supplemented by Lucy Finch, Henry Valdez, and others who had come forward. The narrative was clear. Byron and Celia had systematically used Future Promise Initiative as a front for their illicit gains. Byron's defense tried to poke holes in every witness's story. They suggested Henry Valdez was a bitter ex-partner. They implied Lucy Finch's father had been fired for poor performance, but the more they struggled, the more the evidence spoke for itself. The money trail was undeniable, and it led straight to Byron and Celia. On the fourth day of the trial, Celia took the stand. Her lawyer tried to paint her as a naive business partner who'd been swept up in Byron's grand plans. She cast remorseful looks at the jury, occasionally glancing down, as if too ashamed to lift her eyes. The cross-examination, however, dismantled her performance swiftly. The prosecution presented emails between Celia and Byron discussing planned distributions from the foundation. Celia stammered, unable to provide a coherent explanation. The gallery buzzed with excitement and horror, realizing how deeply she was implicated. On the fifth day, Byron testified. He tried to maintain his composure, but under the prosecution's unrelenting questions, cracks appeared. His repeated statement was, "I was assured by my advisors that everything was legal." Yet multiple documents bore his signature, proving he had explicit knowledge of the transactions. When confronted with the question about Celia's role, he stumbled, shifting blame onto her, claiming she had misled him. The judge's stern look suggested she wasn't buying the finger-pointing. At the end of the second week, it was Ava's turn to be cross-examined by Byron's defense. She sat on the stand, trying to appear calm, though her heart pounded fiercely. Maxwell Boyd grilled her on every detail of her life, from her childhood to her relationship with Byron, insinuating she was complicit in these financial moves until Celia stole her husband. Ava held her ground. Mrs. Rutherford Maxwell said in a sharp tone, "You enjoyed the lavish lifestyle, the parties, the estate. Are we to believe you had no knowledge of how your husband's fortune was maintained?" Ava clenched her jaw, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her belly. "I believed in my husband's integrity," she said. "I trusted him. But once I discovered the truth, I refused to remain silent." He continued, "This was all after you found out about his affair, correct?" Ava lifted her chin. "Yes. But that doesn't change the evidence of the crimes. The affair was a catalyst, but the fraud and money laundering are separate matters entirely. I'm here to tell the truth, not because I'm scorned, but because innocent people, donors, beneficiaries, have been hurt." A flicker of admiration crossed the prosecutor's face. Maxwell tried a few more jabs, but the emotional weight of Ava's testimony, combined with the undeniable paper trail, was too solid to break. As the trial neared its conclusion, the jury grew visibly weary from the whirlwind of numbers, statements, and emotional bombshells. Still, tension crackled in the air. Would the jury buy Byron's defense? Would Celia's crocodile tears sway them? Or would justice prevail? On the final day, each side delivered closing arguments. The prosecution laid out a clear, methodical path of evidence, painting a portrait of two cunning individuals who had exploited the public's goodwill. The defense tried to poke last-minute holes, painting Byron as a busy magnate who delegated too much and Celia as an unwitting pawn. But the air in the courtroom seemed to reject that narrative, filled as it was with the gravity of so many testimonies and documents. Ava watched from the gallery, tears silently sliding down her cheeks. She felt both relief and apprehension. She wanted to see Byron held accountable, but she also mourned the death of the life they'd once planned together. Maybe in another timeline, she thought he wouldn't have fallen into Celia's trap, or greed, or whatever it was that destroyed us. She placed a hand over her belly, inhaling deeply. This child deserved a better world than the one Byron was trying to craft through deceit. The jury went into deliberation. Hours passed, turning into a day, then two. The public waited in frenzied anticipation. Pundits on television speculated on the outcome. Tabloids ran sensational headlines about Ava's courage and Byron's betrayal. And then, on the third afternoon, a court official announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The sun cast long golden rays over Gracemer City the morning the verdict was due. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered as early as dawn. Reporters adjusted microphones. Protesters waved signs both for and against Byron Rutherford. Curious onlookers clustered behind barricades, phones in hand, waiting to capture history. Inside the courtroom, a suffocating stillness filled the air. Ava sat quietly in the front row, dressed simply in a soft navy dress. Her hands rested on her lap, clasped tightly over a photo of Daniel tucked into her purse. Beside her, Grace Weatherly offered a reassuring glance, while Lucy Finch and Henry Valdez flanked her like moral sentinels. Judge Harriet Bloom entered with her usual no-nonsense expression, but there was a gravity in her steps that signaled the moment's weight. The jury filed in next, each face unreadable, their expressions carved from stone. Ava's heart pounded so loudly in her chest, she thought the whole courtroom could hear it. "All rise," the bailiff called out. As everyone stood, the room seemed to hold its breath. Byron and Celia rose too, both visibly shaken. Byron's once impeccable posture had wilted. His bespoke suit hung heavily on him like an ill-fitting shell. Celia, pale and stiff, avoided looking at anyone. Her designer jacket couldn't hide the tremor in her hands. The jury forewoman stepped forward. She held a slip of paper. Her voice, though steady, quivered with the responsibility she carried. In the case of the people versus Byron Rutherford and Celia Duvall on the charge of fraud. She paused. "We find the defendants guilty." A collective gasp rose in the gallery. "On the charge of money laundering, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit tax evasion, guilty." Each word landed like a gavel strike. Ava felt her legs weaken. She gripped the edge of the bench, her eyes burning as tears welled. It was done. The truth had been spoken, not whispered in fear or buried under contracts, but declared aloud before the world. Celia's mouth dropped open. She turned to Byron in panic, her whisper shouted protest barely audible. "This can't be happening. We were supposed to win." Byron didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the floor, jaw clenched, hands limp at his sides. Judge Bloom nodded solemnly. "The court thanks the jury for their service. Sentencing will proceed in the next hearing. Until then, the defendants are to be remanded into custody. Bail is hereby revoked." Chaos rippled instantly. Two court officers stepped forward. Celia jerked in protest, eyes wide with disbelief. "No, please, I need time to fix this. I can explain," she cried, her voice shrill and cracking. One officer took her by the arm while another approached Byron. Byron raised his hands slowly. There was no fight in him, just a haunted look that suggested he finally understood he was no longer untouchable. As the metallic click of handcuffs filled the courtroom, Ava remained seated, staring ahead with tears silently trailing down her cheeks. Celia turned one last time, locking eyes with Ava. Her expression twisted into a mix of contempt and defeat, but Ava didn't flinch. She stared back with calm resolve. The bailiffs led them down the aisle, past spectators whose cameras flashed like strobe lights, past reporters scribbling furiously. As Byron passed Ava, his gaze flicked up, brief, conflicted, hollow. She gave him nothing in return. The courtroom slowly emptied. Reporters scrambled for quotes. Gasps turned to murmurs to headlines. But Ava remained still, her world quiet, except for the sound of her own breath and the gentle thrum of peace returning to her soul. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't bracing for another blow. Justice had arrived. The city of Gracemer hadn't been this quiet in years. In the days following the stunning guilty verdict, a hush fell over the same streets that once echoed with Byron Rutherford's name. News tickers ran non-stop coverage of the trial's fallout. Headlines flashed across every screen: Rutherford Empire collapses, Duvall in cuffed philanthropy fraud, shocks city. Social media swirled with debates, sympathy, and outrage. But inside Ava Rutherford's small rented apartment, the noise didn't penetrate. She sat in her living room with Daniel cradled gently in her arms, staring at the flickering TV screen, not really watching. Her world had shifted so drastically that even silence carried weight. Her phone buzzed constantly calls from reporters, congratulations from strangers, and inquiries from publishers and networks offering deals to tell her story. She ignored most of them. The attention wasn't what she had wanted. She had gone to court for one reason: to protect her child's future, not to become a spectacle. Still, when Allen Winston requested one final quote for the newspaper's closing piece, Ava agreed. "I hope this trial serves as a warning that no matter how powerful someone is, no matter how much they hide behind charity or reputation, truth has a way of breaking through," she said. "But more than that, I hope this reminds women that they are not powerless. You don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to stand." The piece went viral. Byron and Celia's assets were seized. Their sprawling estates, designer furnishings, vehicles, and overseas accounts were frozen or auctioned to recover restitution. A court-appointed trustee began the long task of tracing the siphoned funds to repay victims and restore the dignity of stolen causes. The Future Promise Initiative was dismantled completely, its name now synonymous with greed and betrayal. To Ava, it felt like poetic justice. But justice didn't erase pain. At night, when the city lights dimmed and Daniel finally slept, Ava would stare out the window and remember the man Byron used to be, the man who once brought her sunflowers. Just because it was Thursday, the one who'd danced barefoot with her in the kitchen when they first bought their home. She mourned that version of him, knowing he was gone long before the handcuffs had snapped shut. One sleepless night, she opened a drawer and pulled out their wedding photo. She stared at it for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edges of their frozen smiles. Then, without anger, she slipped it into a box marked "Past" and tucked it away in the closet. Closure, she realized, didn't always come with trumpets or headlines. Sometimes it came quietly, like the closing of a door you no longer needed to walk through. Later that week, Ava received official documents granting her full and permanent custody of Daniel. There would be no further hearings, no custody battles. Byron, now a convicted felon, had relinquished his parental claims. Ava sat in her kitchen after reading the letter, holding Daniel in one arm while sipping tea with the other. Tears rolled down her cheeks, not of grief but relief. The fight was finally over. The same afternoon, Grace Weatherly visited with updates on the civil suits. She brought a tray of baked goods and baby clothes donated from a women's group. As they laughed softly over Daniel's gummy smile, Ava felt something bloom inside her, a peace she hadn't known in years. In this small, quiet apartment, with no marble floors, no camera flashes, no pretense, Ava Rutherford had found what she truly needed. Not revenge, not riches, but a new beginning rooted in truth. The days after the verdict passed in a dreamlike haze. Reporters still loitered outside the courthouse, but Ava no longer drew their focus. Their stories now revolved around prison terms, financial fallout, and what remained of the Rutherford estate. Ava, however, had already turned the page. She moved quietly, deliberately, into a modest rental on the edge of Gracemer City. The house wasn't large, but it was hers, paint-chipped window panes, creaky floors and all. No staff, no sweeping staircases, no gold-plated fixtures. Just sunlight through white curtains, a hand-me-down crib in the nursery, and peace she hadn't felt in years. Daniel arrived on a rainy Thursday night. Grace drove her to the hospital through slick roads and blinding headlights, one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally reaching back to squeeze Ava's arm. The labor was long, and Ava clung to her breath like a lifeline, praying between every contraction that her baby would arrive safely. When she finally held him, it was as if the world reset. Daniel's tiny chest rose and fell against hers, and she traced his face with awe. Byron's eyes, yes, but her quiet strength. She whispered his name into the soft crown of his head. Daniel Elias Rutherford. God is my judge, she murmured. And now you are my purpose. Back home, the rhythm of life was no longer dictated by court dates or media flurries. It was diapers and lullabies, midnight feedings, rocking Daniel to sleep while staring out at moonlit maple trees. The silence, once a sign of emptiness, became sanctuary. But Ava's journey wasn't only inward. With the support of Lucy Finch and Henry Valdez, two people whose courage had bolstered her in her darkest hour, she founded Honor First, a small non-profit focused on offering advocacy, legal support, and financial aid to victims of white-collar crime and financial abuse. What began as 3 volunteers and a borrowed church basement quickly grew. Donations came not from celebrities or PR campaigns, but from ordinary people moved by her story. Survivors reached out with letters. Former employees of the Rutherford Foundation sent messages of support. Even small donors from across the country wrote to say, "You gave me the courage to speak out." Every message reminded Ava why she'd endured what she had. She had taken on one of the most powerful men in Gracemer City and lived to protect not just her child, but countless others who would have been crushed by silence. One afternoon, as Daniel napped beside her on a checkered blanket in the park, Ava received a package from Allen Winston. Inside was the first printed copy of his new book, Betrayal in the Gilded City. On the cover was a shadowed image of the courthouse steps, with Ava's silhouetted figure walking alone, belly swollen with purpose. He'd included a handwritten note. "You didn't just stand up to Byron, you stood up for the truth. Thank you for letting me tell the world." She smiled and tucked the note inside her journal. Though she refused to bask in the attention, Ava agreed to one brief interview. Her only condition was that it not focus on scandal, but on survival. She ended it with a quote that would soon be shared widely. "You don't have to wear armor to be strong. Sometimes showing up when you're broken is the greatest act of courage there is." The courthouse was silent as a tomb as the sentencing hearing began. Even the ever-curious press, so often loud and ravenous, seemed muted by the gravity of what was about to unfold. This wasn't just a routine appearance. This was the end of the road for Byron Rutherford and Celia Duvall. Ava stood just outside the courtroom doors, her heart pounding beneath her blouse. Her arms were wrapped around baby Daniel, who slept peacefully against her shoulder. At her side stood Grace Weatherly, calm as ever, holding a diaper bag in one hand and quiet strength in the other. "You're sure about this?" Grace asked gently. Ava nodded. "He needs to see that we're still standing, that he didn't break us." Inside the room was already packed. The same judge, Harriet Bloom, took her seat at the bench, her presence as imposing as the gavel that echoed across the chamber when she called the court to order. Byron looked nothing like the silver-haired mogul who once ruled Gracemere's social scene. He was gaunt, his tailored suit hanging slightly off his frame, his face lined with months of anxiety and public disgrace. His eyes flicked up as Ava entered with Daniel, but he quickly looked away, shame written in the twitch of his mouth. Celia, seated beside her high-priced attorney, looked ghostly pale. The defiance that once shimmered in her eyes had dulled. No designer dress could shield her from what was coming. Judge Bloom's voice rang out clear and resolute. Having reviewed the overwhelming evidence presented during trial, and considering the victims affected by your fraudulent actions, I hereby sentence Byron Rutherford and Celia Duvall to a pause. The entire room held its breath. 15 years in federal prison with eligibility for parole no earlier than 10. Additionally, both of you are to pay restitution totaling $8. $7 million, which will be distributed among the verified charities you defrauded. Your assets will remain frozen until these funds are recovered. Gasps erupted in the gallery. Celia let out a sob, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Byron simply closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging, as the final nail was hammered into the empire he had spent a lifetime building. But Judge Bloom wasn't done. To Mr. Rutherford, your betrayal wasn't merely financial. You violated the public's trust, your foundation's mission, and the bond of family. To Ms. Duvall, your ambition came at the cost of truth and countless lives. You will both serve your sentences immediately. Two bailiffs stepped forward with cuffs gleaming under the courtroom lights. Ava watched in silence as Byron extended his wrists, the click of steel echoing like thunder. Celia wept as she was restrained, mascara running down her cheeks. As they were led past, Byron slowed for just a moment. He glanced down at the infant in her arms. Daniel stirred and yawned in his sleep, unaware of the broken man before him. Byron's eyes met Ava's. Regret was there, muted too late, but genuine. She gave a small nod, not of forgiveness, but of closure. She had survived. As the courtroom emptied, Grace placed a gentle hand on Ava's back. "It's over." Ava exhaled slowly, the burden she had carried for so long finally lifting. She looked down at her son, then toward the courthouse doors, flooded with afternoon light. "No," she whispered, "it's just beginning." And with Daniel in her arms and her head held high, Ava stepped into the next chapter of her life, free, fearless, and unbreakable. A year had passed since the trial that shook Gracemer City to its core. The courthouse had long since emptied, the reporters had turned their lenses elsewhere, and the public buzz had faded. But for Ava, Rutherford life was just beginning to settle into something she hadn't known in years: peace. In the quiet, tree-lined neighborhood where she now lived, Ava pushed Daniel's stroller down the same path each morning. The air smelled of lilac and new beginnings. Daniel, nearly 1 year old, now babbled happily, pointing at birds in the trees or clapping at passing dogs. His laughter was the music that healed her most. Gone were the days of silk gowns, marble staircases, and media appearances beside a powerful husband. In their place were soft baby blankets, handwritten thank you cards from women Ava had helped, and the unglamorous but deeply rewarding work of rebuilding not just her own life, but the lives of others. Ava had become a quiet fixture in Gracemer's community centers. Word spread of her story, not just of betrayal and courtroom drama, but of resilience and reinvention. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted to inspire. She began speaking to small groups of women, single mothers, domestic abuse survivors, whistleblowers, anyone who had been silenced or shamed. Her presence brought comfort, her story brought courage, and her sincerity brought hope. She also launched a non-profit, Honor First, alongside Lucy Finch and Henry Valdez. The organization offered legal aid, financial counseling, and psychological support to victims of white-collar crime, especially women and families who'd been steamrolled by powerful men. Donations poured in, not from celebrities or politicians, but from everyday people who'd followed Ava's journey and believed in what she stood for. Gracemer City's elite circles no longer whispered about Ava in pity. They now spoke her name with a quiet reverence. She had gone to court in rags and left with her dignity intact, and that dignity had proven more valuable than any fortune the Rutherford name had once held. Still, there were moments when Ava sat by the window, Daniel asleep in her arms, and her mind drifted back to the early days, to candlelit dinners with Byron, to dreams of a perfect life, to the man she once loved before ambition and lies took him away. There was sorrow there, but no longer bitterness. She had learned to mourn the past without letting it define her future. Allen Winston's book, Betrayal in the Gilded City, became a national bestseller. He offered to split a portion of the royalties with Ava's non-profit, an offer she initially declined, but eventually accepted on the condition that it be used only for victims' services. She didn't need the spotlight anymore. Her victory wasn't in headlines or public applause. It was in knowing that her son would grow up in a world shaped by truth, not illusion. One spring afternoon, she sat under a magnolia tree with Daniel nestled against her chest, his small hand gripping her blouse. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting golden flecks across his hair. Ava smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. This was her legacy, not a mansion or a name etched in stone, but a life reclaimed, a future defended, and a child nurtured in love, integrity, and fierce protection. She had walked through fire, and on the other side found herself whole again. And so ends the tumultuous tale of Ava Rutherford, the pregnant wife who refused to bow to deceit and corruption. In the pursuit of truth and justice, she unraveled a labyrinth of betrayal that toppled a mighty millionaire and his scheming mistress. Through heartbreak and trial, Ava emerged stronger, determined to pave a brighter path for her child, one built on resilience and honor, rather than hidden agendas and lies. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on what it means to stand against injustice, please show your support. Like this video, share it with anyone who loves a gripping real-life drama, and subscribe to this channel for more stories that remind us of the power of courage and moral conviction. Together, let's continue shining a light on truth, one story at a time.